This program is about unsolved mysteries. Whenever possible, the actual family members and police officials have participated in recreating the events. What you are about to see is not a news broadcast.
Alcatraz, the Rock. For over 29 years, the nation's most notorious prison, a home for such master criminals as Al Capone, Machine Gun Kelly, and its Birdman, Robert Stroud. Alcatraz stands in the middle of San Francisco's icy cold bay, a treacherous moat that was the best guarantee that nobody would successfully escape. And nobody did until June the 11th, 1962. On that night, 3 men broke out of their cell house and vanished into the waves in a homemade raft. John Anglin, his brother Clarence, and Frank Morris, the brilliant mastermind of the escape, were never seen again. 10 days later, authorities discovered pieces of the raft. It had broken up at sea. The 3 convicts appeared to have swum for it. Did they make it? The debate continues.
If they went into the water with the primitive flotation equipment that they had, they were drowned within 30 minutes. They succumbed to hypothermia and drowned.
I'd stake my life on it, that they're out there in that bay right now, or their bones are out there.
I felt that they didn't make it, but I thought we'd find a body. And we didn't find a body.
I think they made it. If you call the Bureau of Prisons today, they will tell you no one escaped from Alcatraz. They made it.
In the 25 years that have passed since that June night, no trace of Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin has ever been found. They may still be at large, and perhaps are still in hiding. Tonight, in a special 90-minute edition of Unsolved Mysteries, we will see exactly how the inmates conceived and executed their ingenious escape. We'll follow the exact route they took as they broke through the walls of Alcatraz. And just as they faced the icy waters of the San Francisco Bay, we have asked triathlon swimmer Dave Horning to attempt to duplicate their dangerous swim to freedom. We've also built a replica of the convicts' makeshift raft to see if it could possibly survive the 1.5-mile trip across the bay. Renowned endurance swimmer Diana Nyad will closely track Dave and the raft's progress from our camera boat just a few feet away. We'll also take you inside the walls of Alcatraz, where society's most incorrigible criminals, including Al Capone, were finally tamed. So join me for this 90-minute special edition of the Unsolved Mysteries from Alcatraz. In August of 1934, Alcatraz opened its doors. Its inmates, the most troublesome, escape-prone cons in the system, were gathered from prisons around the country. Alcatraz's first convicts were loaded on special armored trains. Shackled to their benches, they made the slow journey to Tiburon on San Francisco Bay. The guards were so concerned about an escape that once there, the railroad cars themselves were loaded onto barges and taken across to the Rock. The men were not allowed out of these train cars until they stepped on the dock of Alcatraz. On Alcatraz, inmates who behaved themselves were given the privilege of working a few hours a day in the Industries building. And here in the laundry, Al Capone, who'd once made $100,000 a week ruling Chicago's underworld, earned 7 cents an hour pressing and folding the clothes of military personnel and the inmates. It was possibly the first honest job he ever held. And Alcatraz was the first institution to truly tame the cunning gangland boss. Capone was convicted of income tax evasion in 1931. Initially, he was jailed in Chicago and then Atlanta, but was able to bribe authorities for special privileges. He had a carpeted cell, a smoking jacket, and was even offered a ticker tape machine to keep track of his investments. At Alcatraz, however, he endured the same Spartan conditions as everyone else.
Al Capone was a very good inmate on Alcatraz. Unfortunately, some of the inmates were very jealous of him because of his millions of dollars, and he was treated very badly by the inmates. One inmate stabbed him one time in the barber shop.
During Capone's first 2 years at Alcatraz, the warden established a policy forbidding the inmates to speak to one another. This strict rule of silence was impossible for the boisterous Capone. On at least 3 occasions, he was caught talking to other inmates, and it was here that he paid the penalty: confinement on Isolation Row. These 200-pound doors of steel blocked out all the light. They forced the inmate to sit in a tiny cell in pitch black dark with no human contact for 24 hours a day. And if a convict was particularly troublesome, his bed, blankets, and clothes would be confiscated, and he had to endure the ordeal naked. When Capone entered Alcatraz, he was diagnosed with syphilis. Capone wouldn't believe it and paid other convicts to take his medicine. After a few years, the guards noticed that the syphilis was affecting his brain. His speech deteriorated, and from time to time he would put his clothes on backwards. Eventually, Capone was completely disabled by the disease. He died on January 25, 1947, 8 years after his release from Alcatraz. One of the Rock's most famous residents was Robert Stroud, who served a life sentence for 2 murder convictions. Stroud initially was incarcerated at Leavenworth, where he spent his time in solitary confinement studying birds and wrote 2 books on their diseases. His life was chronicled in a movie called The Birdman of Alcatraz, starring Burt Lancaster. It painted a heroic picture of Stroud as an oppressed convict tormented by prison officials who wanted to confiscate the 300 birds he had collected.
Robert Stroud was surly, quiet, a morose individual. He did very little talking. Very few of the inmates talked to him, and most of them disliked him.
Stroud was a very intelligent man. With only a 3rd grade education, he could read and write in about 3 or 4 languages. But he was psychotic, very demented man, and at most times very difficult to get along with.
At Leavenworth, Stroud was caught hiding 3.5 gallons of grain alcohol, which he had distilled from birdseed and from contraband smuggled to him in the bottoms of bird cages. For this and other offenses, he was transferred to Alcatraz in 1942.
He had a lot of funny habits. A lot of times he'd walk around in a cell quite naked. He'd also shave every hair off his body, and those were some of the things that were different than most inmates.
On the Rock, Stroud was not allowed to keep a single bird in his cell, but apparently his biographers felt the title Birdman of Alcatraz had a catchier ring than Birdman of Leavenworth. For 30 years, Alcatraz was the most dreaded prison in America. Tough, cold, and virtually escape-proof. 14 escapes were attempted, 10 men died, and all the rest were captured, except 3. Many former inmates believe those 3 made it. One of these inmates was a suspected collaborator, Clarence Carnes. A confidential close friend of the escapees, Clarence Carnes, spent 13 years on Alcatraz and was the youngest person in confinement, arriving in 1946 when he was just 18 years old. That same year, Clarence became embroiled in the bloodiest escape attempt in Alcatraz's history, a desperate bid that resulted in the deaths of 2 guards and 3 inmates. 2 other inmates were executed for their role in the murders, but Carnes was spared and instead received a life sentence. Don DeNevy, a professor at Merritt College in Oakland, co-wrote a manuscript with Clarence Carnes. This was the first insider's account of the escape. Clarence passed away last year, but DeNevy shares his collaborator's opinion.
These guys made it. They made it because Clarence said they did, and I trust that. If you call the Bureau of Prisons today, they will tell you no one escaped from Alcatraz. They made it. This is an embarrassment. Who's going to admit to that?
In Clarence's manuscript, he wrote, "Cowardice in Alcatraz was a thing you didn't run into very often. Most had proven long before they got there that they weren't cowards. The daring escape of Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers, against the longest odds that could possibly exist, is telling proof that Clarence knew what he was talking about. Alcatraz had a deservedly formidable reputation. The ratio of guard to inmate was the highest of any prison in the country, 1 guard to every 3 convicts. Alcatraz was the last stop in the federal prison system, and only the worst troublemakers were sent there. There were few privileges, and for the first 2 years of operation, prisoners were not even allowed to talk to one another. Out of a 24-hour day, 23 were spent in a solitary cell. The inmates were counted at least 14 times a day, but no man-made security precautions could begin to match Alcatraz's most distinguished feature, the bay that surrounds it.
Alcatraz was open because it was hoped to be, and we believe it has been, the inescapable prison.
Alcatraz was never considered escape-proof. It was considered to be a very difficult place to escape from for one reason and one reason only, and that was the water that lay between the island and the mainland, or in the other direction from the island and Angel Island. That was the only thing that made it difficult to escape from Alcatraz, was that water. The water was there. That was the barrier.
Alcatraz's state-of-the-art security included a master control room that oversaw the 3-tiered cell blocks. There, each prisoner was assigned to his own cell. Guards prowled restlessly, looking for signs of trouble.
25, 23, 27, 24.
You got so many counts you make a day, and you got to count bodies. And we had a lot of official counts, and then we had a lot of unofficial counts, which the officer working is supposed to take. So what my opinion is, if you can beat the count, you can escape from any place. If you can't beat the count, you're going to get caught.
One of the hallmarks of Alcatraz's rigid security was the sporadic shakedowns of the prisoners' cells.
Want to open up 143?
Clarence Carnes was often targeted as he worked in the prison library and distributed reading material to the bored prisoners.
Come on out of there, shakedown time.
Authorities suspected that he used this job as a cover to circulate contraband materials. They were correct.
Carnes was the most important inmate on Alcatraz. He had gained the respect of virtually all the other inmates because he knew how to keep his mouth shut. He was, in a sense, the godfather of Alcatraz. Those who needed information, those who wanted advice, sought Carnes out.
Okay, close it up.
Clarence was invited to participate in the escape, but as he was under such close scrutiny, he declined. He did remain close to the plot, a plot that began with a robber named Allen West. West was a close friend of Carnes and was assigned to paint the top tier and ceiling of the cell block at the prison. One day, while working there, he discovered a way to access the prison's roof through a ventilation shaft.
West noticed that the ventilation duct through the cell house roof was constructed in such a way so that there were crossbars in between. You couldn't cut the bars. But West discovered that all you had to do was cut the entire duct from its surrounding support and just shove the whole thing out.
By October of 1961, West had begun planning his escape. He enlisted the help of the Anglin brothers. They had been at the prison for 1.5 years and had a history of escapes from other institutions.
The Anglins were expert raftsmen because they'd grown up in the Florida swamps. They knew how to construct rafts. They knew how to negotiate currents. They were expert swimmers as well.
Perhaps the most pivotal figure in the plot was another bank robber named Frank Morris. According to prison records, he had an IQ of 133, approaching the genius range. His cell was next to Wes, and once he was brought into the plan, he put his intellect to good use. Morris also had a record of other escape attempts. He had been at Alcatraz for 1.5 years.
Morris, if you could use the term, was the intellectual type. He was the thinker. Anything connected with this escape that had any real brains behind it can be credited to Morris.
Well, they found a way to break through the roof. The prisoners still had no way to get to the top of the cell block from their first-floor cells. But Clarence Carnes knew a way. During his few hours of freedom during the 1946 escape, Carnes had discovered this utility corridor that ran the length and the height of the cell block. Inside the corridor were heating and water pipes that formed a makeshift ladder. It was a dangerous climb, but it was the only way the convicts could reach the roof. Word began to circulate through the prison grapevine that an escape was on. It seemed everyone but the guards knew that something was up. Carnes's job made it possible for him to pass information to the 4 ringleaders.
It was not what might be called general knowledge, but I think that there was quite a few of the other inmates that were aware that an escape attempt was being made. And it's surprising to me that this could be the case without some information getting to the authorities.
The convicts on Alcatraz, you know, even if the whole population knew about it, you can almost be guaranteed that the guards would never hear about it. That's just the way the cons on the rock were.
In preparing for their escape, the convicts took advantage of one of Alcatraz's few luxuries.
In the early part of the evening, there was what they call a music hour, and anybody who had a string instrument could play. When that music is playing, it kind of has an effect of deafening the officer who was making his inspections. And the inmates that were digging were just digging away.
You think that somebody's going to escape, they're going to escape out through the front. It never entered my mind that somebody would go back through the corridor. I don't know why. It's like, I guess you don't use the back door.
In between head counts, the Anglins, West and Morris, dug out the rear of their respective cells. West also used the time to craft false ventilation fronts to hide their escape materials. In order to evade the incessant head counts while they prepared their escape, the convicts devised a brilliant ploy.
They decided that they would have to make dummy heads to be in their bunks in case one of them was not in there when the guard would go by. And this was at a time when the lights were turned low and it would be difficult to recognize other than see that a face was in the bed.
Morris asked me about how you mix flesh tone. Because, see, I'm an artist. I did a lot of oil painting on Alcatraz. He asked me a number of times, and I began to wonder, why is he so interested in flesh tone? And then I began to put it all together, because they needed a flesh tone color for the dummy heads.
The construction of these dummies took place after the lights had been extinguished. The dummies themselves were made from soap, concrete powder, and stolen paint. One of the Anglins worked in the barber shop and provided the hair that gave them an extra touch of realism. This is one of the actual dummies the men created, still preserved by the National Maritime Museum across the bay in San Francisco. Now, these are 2 drills used by the convicts. They're constructed from barber shears and parts from a vacuum cleaner. They are thought to have been used to drill through the huge duct leading to the roof. These are the actual spoon handles, which authorities believe were used to dig through the convict cell walls. By the time the convicts had crafted these items, they'd managed to surmount many of the obstacles standing between them and freedom, but huge ones remained. They still had to find a place to hide while they used the drills to cut through to the roof, Additionally, in the midst of the prison's tight security and close scrutiny, they had to find some private space where they could build their raft. Alan West came up with a solution.
Hey, what's going on up there?
When West was painting, some material would get down and get scattered around, and so I don't know who gave the orders that he would be allowed to hang some blankets up along the side of there so that this material would not get thrown over the side. In retrospect, it gave those people a place to work.
For 8 months, the cell house roof was blanketed off, giving the inmates complete privacy to drill out the ventilation shaft and collect the items they needed for their escape. Morris and the Anglins would take turns climbing to this workspace. The dummies left on their pillows enabled them to evade the nightly head count. Each night, with a lookout in place, they would make the hazardous climb to the roof. In his manuscript, Carnes writes, "Many times through the years, I had met men who had tried to escape, but their flaw had been too little planning and being too hasty to try to get away. They had not been thorough in their thinking, and that's what defeated them on Alcatraz." The 4 men who painstakingly prepared their daring escape that winter in 1962 made no such mistakes.
I can hear you all the way up here. You gotta be quiet. Shut up and keep filing. Yeah. Making any progress? Some.
Back in 1962, the Anglins, Frank Morris, and Alan West spent 9 months preparing for their impending swim. And as winter passed into spring, they made their final plans. For the patrolling guards, the spring of 1962 was like any other. But the inmates knew differently, and right under the gaze of their keepers, they helped the 4 escapees in their preparations. One by one, other convicts surreptitiously passed the escapees the raincoats they needed to build their raft and life jackets. At night, the men made their life preservers in their cells and hid them in the partially dug out escape tunnels. In this secret workspace, hidden by the blankets, the Anglins and Morris took turns assembling their raft. They were getting close, very close to the time when they would be ready. June 11th, 1962. The lights had been extinguished. The time to escape had finally arrived. Quietly, the Anglins made the by now routine trip to their workspace, and for the first time, West tried to slip through the hole in his cell wall.
Frank, what the hell's the matter with you? I can't get through, the hole's too small. Everybody's upstairs ready to go.
West had his exit carved out to the point where all he needed was to punch his way through. Suddenly, there's an iron bar that had been used as part of the reinforced masonry when the cell house had originally been built, and that no one knew was there.
Where's West? This hole's not big enough. He needs more help. No way. We're leaving.
Leaving the instigator of the plan behind, the Anglins and Morris finally, in the words of Clarence Carnes, saw the moon for the first time in decades. They were almost free. The convicts descended from a corner of the roof by way of an exhaust pipe adjoining the kitchen. Ironically, though prepared for every security breach inside the prison, security outside was weak. Nobody noticed the men as they carried their raft and life preservers closer to the beach, the last step before the most grueling part of the journey. Only one fence stood between them and the 54-degree waters of San Francisco Bay.
It was so carefully planned, utilizing of dummy faces, the making of the life jackets, the making of a raft. I don't know of any escape from a prison which had more ingenuity utilized.
The escapees were confronted by one final hurdle: how to quietly inflate their huge raft. Their solution was perhaps the most ingenious yet. Frank Morris had received a small accordion called a concertina for use during the daily music hour.
They had taken the keys out of the concertina, and therefore you could put your hand on one strap of the concertina and push it up and down, and it would operate just like a bellows.
Very remarkable exercise of patience and stick-to-itiveness. The only weak point in this escape was the failure to really take serious consideration of that water out there. The record of previous escapes should have been sufficient to deter them from tackling that water. It's impossible to beat that water. That was the mistake.
Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin had made it off the rock. What happened to them next remains a mystery. The following day, it was business as usual on Alcatraz, beginning with a morning head count.
It's a dummy! It's a dummy in 152!
Clarence Anglin, John Anglin, and Frank Morris had escaped. Immediately, an extensive search began, one of the largest manhunts in the country since a Lindbergh kidnapping 25 years earlier.
We were ordered to go out on the bay and, of course, start looking around the island, and then over at Angel Island, scanning the beaches to see if anything that pertained to them might have washed up. And then it became evident that well, we weren't going to find them. Whether they had made it or not, no one knew for sure.
Authorities believed that the men were headed for nearby Angel Island, but for 24 hours, nothing was found. Then remnants of the escapees' raft began to surface, and so too did a controversy on whether or not the men survived. The day after the escape, a homemade oar was discovered floating between Alcatraz and Angel Island. This paddle matched one that the convicts had left behind in the cell block. On June 14th, 2 days after the breakout, a rubber-wrapped packet was also discovered floating near Angel Island. It contained an address book, 80 family photographs, and a money order that belonged to one of the escapees.
My conclusion would be that it was items that these people needed. These were keepsakes of these men. This is all they had in this world. When I seen that, I said, well, I think they didn't make it, because I think it's something that they would even possibly risk their life to save.
On the 15th of June, a prison raincoat was found floating near the north shore of San Francisco. On the 22nd, 10 days after the escape, pieces of the convicts' raft were found, only 50 yards off the east shore of Alcatraz.
I feel sincerely that the flotation equipment that they had came apart on them, and that instead of being able to ride above the water, they were submerged in the water.
Don EBERLE was the FBI agent in charge of the investigation.
Probably the earliest they could have gotten into the water would be 10:30. The outgoing tide started that night at 10 o'clock. And that outgoing tide is very strong. And I firmly believe that they were taken by the currents into the Pacific Ocean.
The day of the escape, a Norwegian ship spotted a body floating 20 miles past the Golden Gate Bridge. Though unable to retrieve it, their description of it matched that of Frank Morris.
They cited what he had on, and it coincided with the apparel of the escapees.
There is some evidence to suggest that at least one of the men survived. The day after the escape, a man claiming to be John Anglin called a San Francisco lawyer known to represent Alcatraz inmates. The attorney in question was out of the office, so the call was transferred to another attorney, Eugenia MacGOWON.
The person called and the receptionist put him through to me, and he said, "I'm John Anglin, and I want you to contact the U.S. Marshal's office to set up a meeting." And I said, "For what purpose?" And he said, "In effect, don't ask questions, just do as I tell you. Call the U.S. Marshal's office to set up a meeting." And I said, "Well, I'm not going to do that unless I know why." And he said, "Do you know who I am?" And I said, "No." He said, "Read the newspaper," and he hung up.
The FBI set up a phone tap in Eugenia MacGOWON's office, hoping the man would call back. He never did, and they eventually ended the surveillance, dismissing the call as a prank. A few weeks after the break, Clarence Carnes claimed he received a postcard from the escapees. In it, they gave the prearranged code words that confirmed their success. The card read, "Gone fishing."
If they had made it to shore, the first thing they would have had to do was take something off of somebody. They would have had to get a car, they would have had to get money, they would have had to do something that would have certainly been noticed.
There were no reports of robberies or car thefts attributable to the escapees. However, the men may have been helped by someone on the outside. Clarence believed the convicts secured the aid of an Alcatraz inmate named Bumpy Johnson.
Clarence shared with me that Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, Black Capone of Harlem, underworld king of Harlem, had arranged for a boat to be out there to pick the Anglins and Morris up. Now, it would have been pitch black out there, but my guess is that they did get to that boat that was waiting for them.
We made it! Come on!
According to Clarence Carnes, the boat then took the convicts to Pier 13 in San Francisco's Hunters Point district.
My feeling is that that's just something that Carnes has dreamed up, and that there is not the slightest possibility there's any truth in it.
My opinion of Clarence Carnes is that he's an inmate of Alcatraz, and any information you receive from him would have to be taken with a grain of salt because of his background, and that you would have to assiduously verify everything that he said. So far, there's never been any indication that what he has said has any truth concerning the fact that they have escaped.
Come on, Wes.
Co-conspirator Alan West was questioned about these outside contacts. He denied they existed.
Wes wouldn't have copped out. He wouldn't cop out. You know, Wes was people. He was solid people. I don't believe he ever, to this day, I don't believe he ever told them nothing.
Today, the FBI and prison authorities have not changed their opinion. They believe the men drowned within minutes of hitting the water.
The escape was just another dismal failure, in our opinion. Now, of course, we never are cocksure enough to say, well, we know they're dead. But we were pretty sure that they were dead because there was no trace of them whatsoever. However, they're still on the missing list and not the dead list.
6 months after the escape of Morris and the Anglin brothers, another attempt proved that they could have survived the swim. It began in the storeroom, located underneath the kitchen. Over a period of time that must have been years, a succession of convicts sawed away at the bars on a window. Some believe they used a spatula stolen from the kitchen. Another theory is that the inmates used pieces of string, covered them in wax, and then dipped them into ordinary kitchen cleanser, making a crude and fragile file. Imagine the frustration of trying to saw through steel with a piece of string. But by December of 1962, 2 men were ready to make the final cut. John P. Scott and Lee Parker, 2 convicted bank robbers, made the last cuts on the bars on December 14, 1962. The cold waters quickly convinced Parker to give up the swim, but Scott was undaunted. He was carried by the current over 3 miles to the south base of the Golden Gate Bridge, where he washed ashore, half frozen and nearly dead, onto a rocky beach. Some children, thinking he had fallen off a boat, alerted authorities. Scott was immediately taken into custody. His escape attempt is the only known case of an inmate surviving the frigid waters, which that December would have been the same temperature as the water in the bay today. On Alcatraz, one of the few privileges granted to inmates was a prison library, and it was here, according to authorities, that the Anglin brothers and Morris had access to 2 magazines that may have aided their escape. The March 1962 issue of Popular Mechanics contained an article on watertight sailing jackets, and the May 1962 edition of Sports Illustrated featured an article on makeshift rubberized boats. Police authorities believe that the men modeled their life jackets and raft on these articles. Was this crudely made raft sturdy enough to survive the forceful currents of the bay? And if the raft did fail, could the escapees have made it to shore by swimming? To test the likelihood of the raft's survival, we've constructed a similar raft out of raincoats. 3 experienced kayakers will attempt to paddle this raft to shore. To test the theory that the convicts had to abandon the raft and swim to shore, we've asked endurance swimmer Dave Horning to brave the frigid waters surrounding Alcatraz and swim to a San Francisco beach. Diana Nyad is standing by with our team of rafters who are just about ready to begin their journey.
The only thing that we're not duplicating accurately from the day of the escape is the time of day. They left at night. Would that have made a tremendous difference?
I don't think a tremendous difference, but I think it is to our advantage in that we can see and make a plan for the first few obstacles that they had to overcome. First of which is this 8-foot seawall, which has these very sharp and slippery, leg-breaking rocks below. The second is that we can see these swirling eddies and currents that are around Alcatraz, and we can make a plan as to how to get out of here. I think the convicts really didn't know where the current was going to take them.
Well, I thank you all very much for your adventuresome spirits, and we'll be checking in with you all the way along. We've switched now to our swimmer, Dave Horning, and Dave has swum some of the coldest bodies of water in the world, including in the Soviet Union. Tell people at home who have never been immersed in dangerously cold water what happens to the body.
As I go into the water here this morning, it'll be like an embracing shock, which will go through my body initially when I hit the water. And there will be some question in my mind in regards to how long I'll be able to last in this 47-degree water.
Okay, now that's you. You're very experienced in cold water. Now, what about these 3 convicts? I understand that they were not even allowed to take cold showers on Alcatraz for fear that they might acclimate themselves to the bay. So what do you think their chances might have been?
Well, I think they had a chance to stay in the water for a certain amount of time because of the fact that they had a certain thing going for them known as motivation, the motivation to get off of Alcatraz and escape from the rock. Once they hit that water, that motivation would concentrate them into being able to generate some adrenaline to keep them going. And once that adrenaline sunk in, that would help keep them insulated for a certain period of time.
Mm-hmm.
But once they started to really succumb to the effects of the cold water, who knows what would happen.
Okay, well, we thank you very much, and good luck to you. The swimmer and rafter will be off in just a few minutes. And, Bob, all I can really say is that I'm just so very happy it's not going to be me in the water today. Back to you.
Thank you, Diana. The route these men will be taking will be the same route it is believed the 1962 escapees followed. The escapees left from the eastern shore of the island, approximately here. If they were attempting to swim to Angel Island, about 1.5 miles away, as the authorities believe, the currents would have carried them away from the island out toward the Pacific Ocean. If they were lucky, they made it ashore at the Golden Gate Bridge. Dave is facing the same conditions, but his plan is to cut across the strong currents here and swim ashore at Crissy Field. Our swimmer and rafters are now in position. Diana will give them the signal to start. Diana, is everyone ready?
Well, Bob, I'd say we're just less than a minute away from getting underway here. Let me quickly set the scene for you. We have a number of camera crews out here, including one up in a blimp to get the aerial view. We also have a couple of paramedic teams, and this is why. The water temperature at 47 degrees is colder than the ice water you keep in your refrigerator. And that means that upon entry, the body dramatically and immediately loses heat. And if you're in there for too long, you go into a state of hypothermia, meaning that the bloodstream and the core organs cannot function properly anymore. And literally, you can go into a state of cardiac arrest. So I don't care how expert a swimmer you are, you take this situation very seriously. Let me check on shore now to see if Dave and our 3 rafters are just about ready to embark. Dave, are you ready? Rafters, all set? Good luck, be safe, everybody. And we'll count from 3, 2, 1, go!
We have asked Dave to wear an underwater microphone so that we can communicate with him if any problems should arise.
You'll notice from the very beginning that Dave will keep up a very, very rapid stroke pace, and that's because he is going to be chilled, almost shocked when he first enters the water, and he wants to generate a great deal of heat. The rafters are going to have even more problems staying warm because they've got to just kind of float and kick behind them with that cumbersome raft. Dave had told me before that he's probably going to get to shore in about 45 minutes, but let's be accurate about the convicts. We look at Dave over here stroking very powerfully, and even though a couple of the convicts, the Anglin brothers, were from Florida, and I understand very good swimmers, still they weren't in this kind of condition. Obviously they hadn't swum in years, they weren't used to cold water, so they were not going to be stroking as powerfully as this. Now if you look back at the rafters, and see just how slowly they are progressing, this is probably more realistic to what went on that night in 1962. You might have had 3 powerful people, but still they weren't used to the cold. It was nighttime, they didn't know precisely where they were going. So I think that this progress that the rafters are doing is probably very similar to what we could expect. And they're probably, if they make it, going to take more like 2 hours. And that would be just at the edge of hypothermia. Later on, we'll be able to see if we talk to him that his face will be quite stiff, his mouth will look as if it's somewhat frozen, and the signs of hypothermia that a trainer would look for as he's swimming is if he becomes confused, if he swims around in circles, if he hallucinates and is telling you that he's seeing things that aren't really there. That's your sign to take your swimmer out and get him warm.
We are now 20 minutes into Dave Horning's attempt to swim from Alcatraz to San Francisco. For years, the guards on Alcatraz told inmates that the bay was infested with man-eating sharks. Marine biologist Leighton Taylor says that is a myth.
There are not man-eating sharks here in San Francisco Bay. There certainly are just outside the Golden Gate on the outer coastal beaches, and I'd really guess that the guards probably told the prisoners about the attacks in 1950s and so forth, and probably really put the fear of God in the prisoners about sharks. But it's not true that San Francisco is a shark-infested bay.
Has there ever been a shark attack inside the bay?
No. There are sharks in San Francisco Bay, but they're mud dwellers and they're on the bottom, and by the time a prisoner got to the bottom, he was out of the picture by then anyway.
I see. Well, thank you. Even though inmates believed there were sharks in the bay, this didn't stop some convicts from trying to make a break for freedom. The first escape attempt was in 1936, just 2 years after the prison opened. Joseph Bowers received a 25-year sentence for stealing $16.63 because he robbed a store in the same building as a post office, a federal offense. He was given the maximum sentence with little likelihood of parole. From the island of Alcatraz, the city of San Francisco seems just an arm's reach away. On April 27th, 1936, Bowers was working at this incinerator. This must have been one of the most tempting spots to try and escape. Suddenly, Bowers appeared to go berserk and began to scale the fence. An alert guard spotted Bowers from a catwalk close by. He yelled at him to stop and fired 2 warning shots over his head. Bowers made it over the top of the fence and began to clamber down the other side. The guard, now aiming to stop him, fired again. Bowers was hit. Wounded, he relaxed his grip on the fence and fell 60 feet to his death. In December of 1937, another escape was tried. This was no impulse, rather a carefully planned scheme that might have been successful. Theodore Cole was 25 with a 50-year sentence for kidnapping. His partner was Ralph Rowe, a 37-year-old bank robber with a long criminal record and a 99-year sentence. On December 16, 1937, the two men were making mats in the industrial building north of the cell block. Even for San Francisco, it was a foggy, cold day. At approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon, they sought out a shop window and broke through a fence. The current was swift that day, running at 8 miles per hour. Grabbing hold of a 5-gallon can, they attempted to swim to freedom.
The Rowe and Cole escape in 1937 was one that I think was impossible to make. The tide was running very swiftly out towards the Golden Gate. The water is 55 degrees. Alvin Karpis, an inmate, told me that he watched Rowe and Cole escape, and as he looked out, he could see the bodies slipping into the bay, and he believed they drowned.
Just recently, John Stanley, a San Francisco reporter, discovered this 1941 article in the files of the San Francisco Chronicle. It claims that Rowe and Cole survived, fled to South America, and then using a secret code contacted their confidants back at Alcatraz. Federal officials still maintain that Rowe and Cole had perished. Perhaps the story was a hoax, concocted by inmates, but to this day, Rowe and Cole are officially listed as missing. This newsreel documents the bloodiest of all the escape attempts on Alcatraz. It began on May 2nd, 1946.
San Francisco Bay. Here, for nearly 40 hours of murderous mutiny, armed convicts shut it out with guards. Ringleaders were Bernard Coy, Louisville bank robber. Joe Kretzer. In cold blood, he shot down unarmed guards in an orgy of murder. Marv Hubbard, Tennessee kidnapper. With 1 rifle and 1 automatic, they waged a desperate but futile fight. You can see the smoke from rifle fire and tear gas bombs as guards fought to rescue prison officials held as hostages in cell block C.
It all began here, in the north end of the cell block, when convicts Coy and Hubbard jumped unarmed guard William Miller, taking his keys and locking him in an empty cell. Coy greased his body and climbed to the top of the cell block, where the bars were weakest. Using a homemade tool, he managed to spread the bars and squeeze through into the gun gallery. Over the next few hours, the convicts captured 9 guards and held them hostage here in these 2 cells. Hour after hour, guards and convicts exchanged gunfire as crowds gathered to watch from the hills of San Francisco. A detachment of Marines scaled the walls and dropped concussion grenades into the cell block from the roof. On the second day, 2 teams of guards entered the cell block. In a furious shootout, the hostages were rescued and the ringleaders killed.
To the guards, all credit. 2 of their number were killed, 15 wounded. Assistant Warden Miller, shot by Coy, scarred perhaps for life. For the criminal ringleaders, this gruesome end. Coy, Kretzer, and Hubbard, fingerprinted as they lie on slabs in the morgue. Theirs is the final reward for a life of crime.
Here's a quick update on both the swimmer and rafters. Dave Horning, just off my shoulder here, is about 35 minutes into the swim, and I would say he's made it 2/3 of the way. Just taking a quick look back there to see just how far he had gone. Quickly to let you know how the rafters are doing at the moment. Now that they have broken free from the shore of Alcatraz, they're actually making much better progress. I keep going back and forth with the potential scenario of those convicts that night. Just a few minutes ago, I thought, boy, they're barely moving. They're never going to make it to land anywhere. Now they've actually been able to catch the current somewhat. They're going maybe 1.5 miles to maybe even close to 2 miles an hour. So I'm switching back the other way again and thinking maybe they could have made it.
I understand that the rafters are getting very cold and frustrated, that they aren't making much progress, that they're only still a quarter of a mile away from Alcatraz. Let's go to Diana.
We have 3 men here who have kayaked all over the world. They're young, they're strong, in excellent shape, and they're having a great deal of difficulty making any progress. And you can see they're being thrown around by the tide left and right. Probably what was happening that night to the convicts out here was just some desperation, not a goal of getting somewhere, but just to get anywhere. I'm sure the convicts didn't have much traffic out of here on the bay, but our swimmer and rafters today are having a great deal of traffic. We've got barges, tugboats, tourist boats, etc., not to mention a number of seals. So it's somewhat entertaining, although they're casting quite a bit of wake. Just to check on Dave's medical condition, we've asked him a few simple questions, like his name, the same way that referees in boxing ask the fighters if they're coherent. He's responded very well, but evidently he is cramping in one leg. Cramps can be very, very serious in the water, but we still assume that he's going to be okay.
Dave is only a few yards away from completing his swim. Diana, how's he doing?
The one thing I'm concerned about is not the cold, but the cramp in his leg. We still assume that since he's closing in on the beach, that he's going to be okay. And we should mention here, we've talked so much about hypothermia. Your core temperature actually goes down even further once you get out from a spell in cold water. So when he gets out of here, we're going to be able to talk to him very briefly, but 3 or 4 minutes after that, he's going to have to get warm. And the way he does it is put on a pair of running shoes and go for a jog and generate his own heat. It's actually the best way to do it. Well, it looks conclusive. Dave is literally 20 yards from the shore. Lifeguards have now entered the water with him for the last few feet, especially having reported a cramp, just to make sure that he's able to walk out. And he seems to be just fine. We'll have a word with him in just 30 seconds or so.
Excuse me, Allison.
Yeah! That was really cool.
All right, Dave, I know we don't have much time before you get your running shoes on. Tell me your experience, first of all. You came in just a little bit over an hour. How was it out there?
It was great. When I first hit the water, the cold shock of the water definitely was embracing. Halfway through the swim, my feet and legs went numb, and in the final 10 to 15 minutes, both legs totally cramped up, and I really had to wonder whether I'd be able to make it in.
I can hear just the way you're talking and a slightly bit of slurred speech. Is your mouth quite frozen in place?
Slurred, definitely due to the cold chin. I'm glad I didn't have to stay in more than at least another hour.
Well, listen, this brings us to your opinion now that you've done it. Do you believe they could have made it?
There's no question in my mind that they could have made it. The question is how they would have felt. It's the coffee that probably would have been their motivation.
Okay, well, listen, we thank you so much for your brave effort today. And I'm going to reserve my opinion later because Dave Horning is one thing, the rafters are another thing. So we're going to go back out and check and see how they actually do.
Wow, what a beautiful day.
Dave has succeeded in his swim to Crissy Field. However, the rafters have only reached this point, a quarter mile off Alcatraz. Let's go back to Diana for an update on the rafters.
They are not doing well. They just haven't made much progress. They came around Alcatraz very quickly, but now they're kind of stuck in the front of the island, maybe kept in by that incoming flood tide. Come on over, Bill. So, I know you're strong. It must not be you guys. What's happening out there?
We're actually fairly comfortable, but we're not getting anywhere, and the boat is starting to fall apart. And we think even with we have certain advantages with the type of rig we have, and if we're trying to really assess how the convicts did, we don't think they did very well. We have a little more modern clothing on, and think that given the situation when they left at night and knowing where they're going, they're in pretty weak condition from not having much exercise at the prison. they probably at least were very uncomfortable, more likely got hypothermia and just didn't get anywhere. We were actually very confident when we were leaving Alcatraz and the boat was in good condition. But the more time we had to think about it, the more unlikely the whole possibility of them surviving seems. These guys were career convicts, and they haven't shown up since. And you would think over 20-some-odd years they would have probably committed another crime and gotten caught. So I have a feeling they're fish food.
Did the Anglin brothers and Frank Morris survive their daring escape? Based on what we've seen today, it certainly is possible. Yet it seems odd that in the last 27 years, so few clues have surfaced to prove that they made it. Whether or not the men survived, their escape compromised the reputation of Alcatraz. And less than a year later, the prison closed. For that reason alone, it can be said the men did beat the rock. Our thanks to Diana Nyad. Congratulations, Dave. And thank you very much for you brave men on the raft. Join us again next week for another edition of Unsolved Mysteries.